When the fire alarm blared at school, Sophie froze, panic crushing her chest. The world blurred, until a familiar weight pressed against her leg. Valor was there, steady, unshakable, reminding her to breathe. That moment was just one of many, in a journey that began with silence and grief, and grew into courage and hope. From whispered prayers at her father's memorial, to bold words spoken in a crowded store. Sophie's transformation is not just a child's healing. It's a testimony to the power of presence, loyalty, and love. And at the heart of it all was a German shepherd, whose name, fittingly, was Valor. The doors of the community center creaked open on a gray afternoon, letting in a current of cold spring air that carried the faint smell of rain. Inside, rows of chairs stretched neatly across the polished wooden floor, every seat filled with faces marked by quiet sorrow and solemn respect. The walls, usually adorned with bright community posters and children's art, had been draped with black banners and wreaths of white lilies. Today was not for celebration. Today was for remembrance. The annual ceremony to honor the city's fallen rescue workers always drew a crowd. But this year, there was a heaviness unlike before. Conversations whispered in hushed tones, the kind that broke easily under the weight of grief. Children clung to their mothers, eyes wide but confused, not old enough to understand what was being mourned, only sensing that something sacred hovered in the air. Decorated officers sat in their crisp uniforms, rows of medals gleaming faintly beneath the dim lights. Their backs were straight, their faces disciplined, but their eyes betrayed fatigue, years of carrying both duty and loss. At the front of the hall, a long table was lined with velvet boxes, each one holding a medal that bore the city's crest. They caught the light and threw it back coldly, symbols of bravery that came at the steepest cost. A folded flag rested at the center of the table, its stars stark against the dark fabric, a reminder of what had been given and what could never be returned. The murmur of the crowd dimmed as an organist pressed down the first somber notes of a hymn. The sound filled the air like a prayer unspoken. Heads bowed. Some closed their eyes, whispering names to themselves. Names of husbands, wives, sons, daughters. Those who had run toward fire and chaos when everyone else had fled. Those who hadn't come back. In one row near the center, a space seemed emptier than the others, though it was physically filled. Grace Bennett sat there, her spine rigid, her hand clutching the wooden handle of her daughter's wheelchair. Beside her, little Sophie sat motionless, her legs covered by a pale blanket, her small hands folded in her lap. She looked like a porcelain figure placed in the middle of the living, too fragile, too quiet. The absence of Daniel Bennett, Grace's husband and Sophie's father, was a wound no banner or medal could soothe. His missing presence pressed against the room, sharp as broken glass, even though no one spoke his name yet. Grace's eyes moved across the hall, but never lingered. Everywhere she looked, she saw echoes of him. Men in uniforms he once wore, medals like the ones he had earned, families clutching framed photographs like the ones still resting on her mantel at home. She swallowed hard, her throat raw. Today was meant to honor him. But how did one honor a man whose heartbeat had been silenced in a blink of headlights and shattered glass? The master of ceremonies, a tall man with gray hair and a voice both steady and strained, stepped onto the stage. The microphone crackled, drawing everyone's attention. "We gather here today," he began, his voice low, reverent, to honor those who place the lives of others above their own, to remember the men and women who, in the face of danger, chose courage. Some wore helmets, some uniforms, some bore scars, invisible to the eye. All of them wore sacrifice. The words hung in the stillness, drawing out soft murmurs, nods, and the occasional quiet sob. From the corner, a child whispered a question, too loud. "Where's Daddy?" and was quickly hushed by trembling hands. That whisper pierced the hall more sharply than any anthem. Grace's grip tightened on the wheelchair. Her knuckles whitened. She felt Sophie shift slightly, though her daughter's face remained blank, eyes downcast, detached from the world around her. Grace longed to reach down and stroke Sophie's hair, to tell her it was all right. But her body felt locked, trapped between the weight of pride and the ache of unbearable loss. The organ fell silent, replaced by the sound of shoes on wood as a color guard marched in. They moved in perfect unison, flags raised high, boots echoing. Every step was a reminder of discipline, of honor, of tradition. But for those who had come with hearts shattered, it was also a reminder of finality. Grace's eyes blurred with tears she refused to let fall. She pressed the damp handkerchief in her palm harder, the fabric twisted between her fingers. The chief of rescue operations stood and walked to the table of medals. His uniform was adorned with years of service, his face lined with fatigue. When he spoke, his voice did not carry the polish of a rehearsed speech. It carried the weight of grief shared. "Each medal before you tells a story," he said. "Stories of courage, stories of lives saved, stories of families changed forever. Behind every name we honor tonight, there is a family sitting among us who knows the cost better than anyone." Eyes in the room lowered, heads bowed. The silence deepened. It was as though the walls themselves were listening, bearing witness. Grace's breath caught when she heard the name before Daniel's. Another father, another husband, another soul gone too soon. A widow walked to the stage, guided gently by her son. Applause filled the hall, soft and respectful, as she accepted the medal. Grace's chest tightened. She knew she would make that same walk soon, with Sophie by her side. Her heart ached, not just for her own loss, but for the ripple of absence surrounding her. The ceremony was not about one man. It was about all of them. An entire brotherhood and sisterhood whose courage had built invisible bridges of safety for strangers. Yet in that moment, Grace could think only of Daniel. His laugh. The way he bent down to kiss Sophie's forehead at night. The way his shoulders carried the weight of storms without complaint. He should have been here. A draft of cool air passed through the hall, making candles flicker. Someone whispered that it was like the spirits of the fallen had come to sit among them, unseen, but present. Grace closed her eyes, daring to believe for just 1 second that Daniel was near, that his hand might brush against her shoulder, if she was still enough, quiet enough. But when she opened her eyes, it was just the hall again, solemn, filled with grief, waiting for names to be called. The anticipation in the room thickened with every medal given, every story spoken aloud. The hall seemed to lean forward, hearts bracing for what was to come. They all knew Daniel Bennett's name would be called soon, and when it was, something inside this room, inside Grace and Sophie, would change forever. The aisle stretched longer than Grace remembered, lined with faces she could not bear to meet. Some eyes softened with pity, others with quiet admiration, but all of them reminded her of the same truth. She was walking forward because Daniel could not, Her hand gripped the cool metal handle of Sophie's wheelchair, her knuckles white beneath the pressure. In her other hand, a handkerchief, creased, damp, and worn from too many nights of clenching it in the dark. The organist's hymn lingered faintly, its last notes drifting like smoke as she moved down the center of the hall. Each step seemed amplified, her heels echoing against the wooden floor. It was not her name being called yet, not Daniel's, but she knew the moment was approaching. There was no escaping it. Sophie sat still, a fragile figure in her chair. The pale blanket draped over her small legs was carefully tucked in, neat folds pressed by Grace's trembling hands that morning. Her cotton dress, dotted with little embroidered daisies, looked as though it belonged to another life, one where Sophie still ran barefoot in the grass, chasing dragonflies under the summer sun. Today, that life felt impossibly distant. Her daughter's face was blank, her eyes unfocused, fixed somewhere far beyond the walls of the hall. Grace longed to hear a laugh, a question, even a complaint, anything. But silence wrapped Sophie as tightly as the blanket, a silence so deep it frightened Grace more than tears ever could. She leaned down slightly as they moved forward, whispering words that went unanswered. "Almost there, sweetheart. Just a little further." Her voice cracked in the middle, but Sophie did not respond. As they approached the front rows, memories struck Grace like shards of glass, vivid, unbidden, impossible to suppress. The accident had not been a slow unraveling. It was instant, brutal. Rain hammering against the windshield. Headlights cutting through the storm like the eyes of a predator. The screech of tires, a horn blaring too late. She remembered the way Daniel's arm shot across the seat, shielding Sophie's tiny body with his own. She remembered the force of impact, the world spinning in metallic screams and shattered glass. And then, silence. Daniel's chest heaving raggedly, Sophie's cry muffled beneath his weight. Grace's own voice begging, screaming, clawing at his shoulders. But his body had already gone limp. That memory lived beneath her skin now, flaring whenever she closed her eyes. It lived in Sophie's silence, in the way she hadn't spoken since that night. Grace could not decide which was harder to bear, the memory of Daniel's last breath, or the absence of Sophie's voice. As they reached their row, Grace paused. She pressed the handkerchief to her lips, steadying herself. People turned, offering nods of respect, but she could not nod back. Her body felt like it was made of stone. All she could do was keep pushing forward. Every detail around her seemed painfully sharp. The glint of medals lined on the stage, the smell of lilies and candle wax mixing in the air, the faint scrape of a chair leg as someone shifted uncomfortably. The world was moving on, one breath at a time. But Grace felt trapped in the moment Daniel left. She stole a glance down at Sophie. Her daughter's lashes trembled faintly, but her gaze remained distant. Grace wanted to bend down, to cup Sophie's face in her hands, to tell her how much she was loved. But what good were words, when her child had buried hers so deep inside she might never speak again? The chief on stage adjusted the microphone, and his voice boomed again, reciting the names of those lost. Grace flinched with every pause, every surname called out, and met with applause too soft to resemble joy. Soon, it would be Daniel's name. Soon, she would walk that aisle with Sophie in front of the entire city, carrying the weight of a sacrifice her husband never meant to make. Pride warred with grief inside her. She was proud of the man Daniel had been. Brave, selfless, relentless in his devotion to others. He had saved strangers with the same urgency he once used to scoop Sophie into his arms after a scraped knee. But pride was not enough to soften the edges of loss. Pride could not fill the empty side of her bed. It could not replace the sound of his laughter in the kitchen or the warmth of his hand against her back. Her grip tightened on the wheelchair again, guiding Sophie toward the front. Each push felt heavier, as though the chair was carrying not just her daughter, but all the grief Grace had refused to let surface. She blinked back tears, willing herself not to falter. Not here. Not yet. As they reached their place near the stage, the hall seemed to still. The organist rested his hands. The audience straightened in their seats. Somewhere in the distance, a baby cried softly, before being hushed. Grace felt every eye on her, on Sophie, on the empty space where Daniel should have been. She lowered herself onto the chair beside Sophie, folding the handkerchief in her lap, her hand trembling against the fabric. Sophie remained unmoving, her eyes fixed downward, as if she were determined not to see the table of medals. Grace reached out slowly, her fingers brushing against her daughter's hand. Cold, still, fragile. She whispered again, almost inaudibly, "He's watching us, Sophie. He's here." For a heartbeat, she thought she saw a flicker. Sophie's fingers twitching, her lips parting, but then the stillness returned. Grace exhaled shakily, her chest aching. She looked back toward the stage, blinking rapidly to keep her vision clear. She would not collapse. She could not. Sophie needed her steady. And yet, beneath all the discipline, the composure, and the silence, there was an undercurrent of dread, because she knew the next name was Daniel Bennett. And when it was spoken aloud, when the room rose in respect, she and Sophie would be dragged once more through the fire of loss. The anticipation pressed in on her like a storm cloud ready to break. And as the chief shuffled the papers in his hand, clearing his throat, Grace tightened her grip on Sophie's wheelchair and braced herself for the moment that would tear them open again. The hall seemed to hold its breath as the chief of rescue operations adjusted his papers. His voice, steady though laced with sorrow, cut through the stillness. "For extraordinary bravery in the line of duty," he began, pausing just long enough for the silence to grow heavy, "we honor Daniel Bennett." The name landed like a stone, dropped into a deep well. For Grace, the echo rippled through every vein, every memory, every heartbeat that still longed for the man who had been her anchor. She rose slowly, her knees unsteady, and guided Sophie's wheelchair toward the stage. The applause that followed was respectful, but hollow in her ears. It was not the sound of celebration. It was the sound of grief made audible, each clap a reminder of what she had lost. Grace's free hand clutched the handkerchief tighter, the fabric nearly tearing under her grip. Sophie's small hands rested motionless on her lap, pale and lifeless. Her eyes did not flicker toward the medal waiting in its velvet box. She stared at nothing, lost in the void where her father's presence used to be. When they reached the center of the stage, the chief leaned forward, his face lined with empathy that words could not cover. He opened the box and presented the medal. The polished silver caught the light, gleaming against the dark backdrop. Grace extended her hand to accept it, her fingers trembling. "Your husband saved lives until the very end," the chief said softly. His voice meant only for her. Grace nodded, though her throat closed too tightly to form a reply. She placed the medal in Sophie's lap. Her daughter's hands remained limp, unmoved by the weight of honor or loss. The sight hollowed Grace further. The audience sat in reverent silence. For a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the building's old ventilation system and the muffled sobs of someone in the back row. It felt as though the ceremony itself might fracture under the pressure of sorrow. And then it happened. From the far side of the auditorium, there was a stir. Chairs creaked as people turned their heads. A murmur swept through the hall like a ripple of wind across water. Emerging from the shadows of the side aisle, a figure moved with steady grace, 4 paws pressing quietly against the wooden floor. Valor. The German shepherd, who had once run through fire and rubble alongside Daniel, who had carried the weight of countless missions without question. His coat gleamed faintly in the dim light, streaked with grey at the muzzle, but his posture was unbroken, strong, deliberate, noble. His amber eyes were locked not on the stage, not on the medal, not on the chief, but on Sophie. "Valor," someone whispered from the rows of officers. A handler reached for his leash, but the dog did not stop. He moved forward with calm certainty, his steps unhurried, yet unstoppable. Grace froze, her breath caught in her throat. She turned her gaze toward the shepherd, heart pounding. She had seen Valor before, in photographs beside Daniel, in fleeting glimpses at the rescue station. But never like this, never with such purpose in his stride. The audience grew so silent that the soft click of Valor's nails against the floor was the loudest sound in the hall. Step by step, he closed the distance. Sophie's head turned, a faint movement, almost imperceptible. Her eyes, usually dull and far away, focused for the first time in months. She saw him, and something stirred. When Valor reached the edge of the stage, he did not leap, did not bark, did not demand attention. He climbed the steps one by one, his body moving with solemn dignity, until he stood beside Sophie's wheelchair. The hall collectively held its breath. Valor paused, then slowly lowered his great body to the ground. His front legs stretched forward, his back legs folded in, and with deliberate reverence, he bowed his head. One paw lifted and rested gently on the metal footrest of Sophie's chair. The gesture was simple, wordless, yet it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. I remember him. I miss him too. I am here for you now. Sophie's lips parted, her chin trembling. Her fingers twitched against the blanket. The silence in the hall thickened, so fragile that even a cough might have shattered it. Grace's eyes widened, tears threatening to spill. She leaned closer to her daughter, praying for a sign, any sign. And then it came. Barely above a whisper, fragile as glass, yet strong enough to pierce the air, Sophie's voice broke free. Valor. It was the first word she had spoken since the night of the accident. The sound hung in the hall like a prayer, released after too many silent nights. Gasps echoed softly among the audience. Grace covered her mouth with her hand, a sob bursting from her chest as tears streamed down her face. She had waited months, endless nights of reading bedtime stories unanswered, mornings filled with silence, therapy sessions that ended in despair, for this single, miraculous word. Sophie's small hand, trembling but sure, reached out. Slowly, hesitantly, she placed it on top of Valor's head. The shepherd pressed into her touch, nestling beneath her arm as though he had been waiting all along for this moment. The hall erupted, not in applause, but in something deeper. A collective exhale, a reverent awe that swept through the crowd. Even the chief lowered his head, his eyes wet with emotion. Officers who had seen flames consume entire buildings, wiped at their faces with the backs of their hands. Grace knelt beside Sophie, clutching her daughter's free hand. "You said his name," she whispered, her voice breaking. Sophie's gaze never left Valor, her fingers curling slightly in his fur. The German shepherd remained still, unwavering, a bridge between past and present, loss and healing. That day, no medal, no speech, no anthem etched itself into the hearts of those who attended. What remained was the sight of a girl in silence finding her voice again, drawn out not by ceremony or command, but by the quiet loyalty of a dog who carried the memory of her father. And from that moment on, the story of Sophie Bennett and Valor began, not as a tale of tragedy, but as a journey toward light. The ceremony lingered in the air long after the last name had been read, long after the final hymn faded into silence. People rose slowly from their chairs, some embracing quietly, others filing out into the grey afternoon with red-rimmed eyes and folded programs clutched against their chests. The scent of lilies and candle wax clung to the walls, heavy and unyielding. Grace remained seated near the front, one hand still resting on Sophie's shoulder, the other curled tightly around the medal. Her body felt drained, as though the weight of grief had seeped into her bones. She had braced herself for many things that day. For the moment, Daniel's name echoed through the hall, for the applause that felt more like mourning than honor. But she had not braced for Valor. Even now, the German shepherd sat beside Sophie's wheelchair, his head resting lightly against the armrest, as though it had always been his place. Sophie's small hand remained in his fur. Her fingers tangled as if she feared letting go might banish him back to the shadows. Grace could not look at them without feeling the sharp ache of Daniel's absence and the faint, fragile bloom of something she had not dared hope for, connection. A hand touched her shoulder gently. Grace turned to find Captain Hughes, Daniel's former commander, standing over her. His uniform looked pressed and formal, but his eyes carried the weariness of too many funerals. "Grace," he said softly, almost apologetically. "Can we speak for a moment?" She nodded, though her throat tightened again. Hughes crouched slightly to meet Sophie's line of sight, offering her a small, respectful smile before straightening. His gaze shifted to Valor, who lifted his head, ears pricking as though waiting for instruction. "He shouldn't have been loose in here," Hughes said with a faint sigh, "but maybe it wasn't an accident." His voice wavered just enough for Grace to catch it. Valor was Daniel's partner. They worked side by side for years. He's different from most dogs, loyal in ways that go beyond training. Grace swallowed hard, fingers twisting the medal in her lap. "I remember Daniel talking about him," she said quietly. "He said Valor never left his side." Hughes nodded. His gaze lingered on Sophie, her hand still clutched around the dog's fur. "That loyalty doesn't fade just because a handler is gone. Valor knows. He remembers. And what I saw today," Hughes exhaled slowly, shaking his head, "I think he's chosen." Grace blinked, uncertain. "Chosen?" "To stay with you," Hughes said simply. His tone carried no ceremony, no grand gesture, only conviction. He was Daniel's partner. Now he should be yours. The words hung in the air, heavier than the silence that followed. Grace felt her chest tighten. The thought of bringing Valor home, of allowing him to fill the void Daniel had left, felt both impossible and inevitable. "I don't know if I can—" Her voice broke, the truth spilling out raw and unpolished. "Every corner of our house already feels like a ghost. I don't know if I can take another reminder." Hugh's gaze softened. "Grace, with respect, You don't need a reminder. You need a bridge, and so does Sophie. Grace looked down at her daughter. Sophie had not spoken again since whispering Vala's name, but there was something alive in her eyes now, something Grace had not seen in months. Not joy, not yet, but recognition, connection. Grace's hand trembled as she reached out, brushing her fingers gently against Vala's head. The shepherd closed his eyes briefly, leaning into her touch as though it had been waiting all along. Hughes straightened, his voice lowering. There's no paperwork, no official process for this. If you'll accept him, Vala will go home with you tonight. If not, he'll stay with the unit. He hesitated. But I think you already know where he belongs. The hall had nearly emptied now. Only a few officers lingered in small groups, speaking in low tones. The candles flickered faintly, the air thick with endings. Yet when Grace looked at Vala beside Sophie, she did not see an ending. She saw something unfamiliar, fragile but undeniable, a beginning. Her eyes burned as tears finally slid free. She nodded, barely able to form the words. All right. He comes with us. Hughes's shoulders relaxed, his expression one of quiet relief. He reached down, unclipped the official tag from Valor's service vest, and placed it in Grace's hand. Then he's yours. For the first time in months, Grace felt something other than despair bloom inside her chest. It was small, unsteady, like the first breath after drowning. She pressed the tag into her palm, closing her hand tightly around it. Sophie looked up at her mother then, her eyes shining with something Grace had nearly forgotten. Hope. Her lips didn't form words, but her hand squeezed Valor's fur more tightly, as if to say what she couldn't yet speak. Grace bent down and kissed the top of her daughter's head, whispering through tears, He's ours now, sweetheart. He's home. Vala shifted, pressing his head gently against Sophie's arm before settling back into place. The weight of his body against her chair was steady, grounding, like a vow made in silence. And in that quiet, amidst the fading echoes of sorrow, Grace understood what Hughes had meant. Vala was not a reminder of what they had lost. He was a bridge to what they still had left, and perhaps to what they could find again. The parking lot outside the community center was nearly empty by the time Grace wheeled Sophie toward the car. The gray clouds that had loomed all afternoon had finally begun to break, letting streaks of pale sunlight slip through. The light caught the damp pavement, reflecting the rows of departing cars until they seemed like ghosts fading into the horizon. Grace opened the back door of her sedan, guiding Sophie carefully into her seat. The small rituals of strapping her daughter in, the click of the buckle, the adjustment of the blanket over her legs, were motions Grace had done 100 times. But tonight they felt different, heavier, as though each gesture carried the weight of 2 people instead of 1. Vala stood nearby, his ears pricked, eyes steady. He waited until Grace opened the other back door before stepping forward. Without hesitation, he leapt smoothly inside, circling once before settling with his large body pressed lengthwise along the seat. His head came to rest near Sophie's lap, close enough that his breath warmed the fabric of her dress. Grace paused, watching the scene through the open door. Sophie's small hand, pale against the blanket, lifted slowly. There was no hesitation this time, no tremor. Her fingers slid into the shepherd's thick fur. She stroked once, twice, then again, her movements tentative but deliberate. Vala closed his eyes, releasing a slow, steady exhale, as though acknowledging the beginning of a bond too delicate for words. For a moment, Grace could not move. She stood outside the car, one hand on the doorframe, her heart aching at the quiet intimacy before her. Sophie had not reached for another hand since Daniel's. And yet here she was, reaching now. Not for Grace, but for Valor. And somehow, that was enough. Finally, Grace slid into the driver's seat. The car smelled faintly of leather and the lingering sweetness of Sophie's shampoo. She turned the key, and the engine hummed to life. Headlights glowed against the damp lot, casting long beams that stretched out into the fading evening. They drove in silence. The road home was familiar, lined with bare trees just beginning to sprout green, storefronts half-lit, traffic lights swaying gently in the wind. Yet tonight it felt transformed, as if the world outside had shifted in response to what had unfolded in the hall. Grace's hands gripped the steering wheel, steady but taut. Her eyes flicked to the rearview mirror more often than necessary, drawn again and again to the sight of Valor's head resting near Sophie's lap. Each time she looked, she saw her daughter's hand still moving, slow and rhythmic, brushing through the shepherd's fur. Sophie's face remained quiet, her lips pressed together, but there was something softened about her features. Not joy, not yet, but less hollow, less gone. Grace swallowed hard, her throat tight with conflicting emotions. She thought of Daniel. The way he used to sit in the passenger seat, one hand resting lightly on the console, humming tunelessly under his breath. The way Sophie used to chatter from the back seat, kicking her heels against the upholstery while Daniel teased her into laughter. Now the seat beside her was empty, and the back seat was silent, except for the steady sound of Valor's breathing. It was strange, she thought, how grief and comfort could collide in the same breath. Valor was Daniel's shadow, his partner, his legacy. Having him in the car felt like having Daniel near again. But it also tore her open, reminding her of what had been stolen on that rainy night. Her mind drifted back to the accident, unbidden. The storm, the headlights, the sickening crunch of metal. The way Daniel had thrown himself across Sophie, his arms a shield, his body the final barrier between his daughter and death. Grace had screamed his name until her throat bled. She remembered the silence afterward, the silence that had never quite left Sophie. She blinked hard, forcing herself back into the present. She glanced at Sophie again in the mirror. Her daughter's head had tilted slightly toward Valor, her fingers curling into his fur as if anchoring herself there. Grace felt tears sting her eyes, but this time she did not fight them. Perhaps Daniel had not left her completely. Perhaps he had left something behind, something breathing, loyal, steadfast. At a red light, Grace let her hand slip from the wheel and pressed it against her lips, muffling the sob that broke free. She turned her head slightly, looking back. Sophie's gaze was downcast, focused entirely on Valor. She hadn't noticed her mother's tears, or perhaps she had, but chose this moment, this fragile connection, over everything else. The light turned green. Grace pressed the accelerator gently, the car gliding forward. The minutes stretched. The city thinned into quiet neighborhoods, houses lined with budding gardens and porch lights flickering on. The Bennett home waited at the end of a street. Grace had once thought ordinary. Now it felt like a place transformed, emptier without Daniel, yet about to be filled again in a way she hadn't expected. As the car turned into the driveway, the sun slipped low behind the houses, painting the sky in muted shades of lavender and gold. Grace parked, cutting the engine. The hum faded, replaced by silence. But it was not the heavy silence of loss this time. It was softer, steadier, shaped by the quiet rhythm of Sophie's hand in Valor's fur. Grace sat for a long moment before moving, her fingers still clenched around the steering wheel. She breathed in slowly, letting the image in the mirror etch itself into her memory. Her daughter, not speaking, not smiling, but reaching, finally reaching. She whispered under her breath, almost like a prayer carried to the man who could not be there. "Daniel, he's with us now." Outside, the evening air cooled quickly, brushing against the car windows. Inside, a fragile bond was taking root. And though Grace knew the road ahead would not be easy, she understood that something had shifted tonight. Valor had not simply been handed over. He had been chosen, and in choosing Sophie, he had given Grace something she thought she had lost forever: hope. The house had never felt so quiet. Grace stood in the doorway of Sophie's room, one hand braced lightly against the frame, staring into a space that had carried too much silence for far too long. The soft pink curtains were drawn closed, muting the glow of the streetlight outside. The faint hum of the heater filled the corners, but it wasn't enough to mask the emptiness that usually pressed in at night. Tonight, though, something was different. Sophie lay on her back, beneath the quilt stitched by her grandmother years ago, her small figure dwarfed by the folds of fabric. Her honey-colored hair spread across the pillow like threads of light in the dimness. For months, Grace had grown used to the sight of her daughter lying motionless at bedtime, eyes open but distant, her silence heavier than the darkness itself. But now, at the foot of the bed, there was another presence. Valor had leapt up with surprising gentleness, circling once before, curling himself into a protective crescent near Sophie's feet. His body rose and fell with slow, steady breaths. The soft sound of his exhale filled the room like a lullaby no human could sing. Each rise of his chest seemed to push back against the grief that had clung to the house since Daniel's death. Grace's gaze traveled to Sophie. The little girl's hand, small and delicate, had slipped from beneath the quilt. Tentative at first, it now rested on Valor's back. Her fingers moved ever so slightly, brushing against his thick fur, almost as though she were testing if he was truly there or just another dream. Valor shifted in response, pressing subtly closer, his warmth seeping into the mattress. The sight tore Grace open. For months, she had sat on this very threshold, night after night, reading bedtime stories aloud into the void, waiting for Sophie to respond, to smile, to protest when she closed the book too soon. But Sophie had never spoken. Not one word. Grace had listened to her daughter breathe in silence, and sometimes, when Sophie turned away, she had wondered if her child's soul had retreated to a place she could never follow. Now, the hand that had been so lifeless rested on a living creature, and the quiet was not so unbearable. It was softer, textured by the sound of companionship. Grace pressed her hand against her lips, fighting back a sob. She could almost see Daniel in the room, kneeling at Sophie's bedside, brushing the same hair back from her face, whispering the same words of comfort Grace had whispered, but could never reach. Daniel would have known what to do. He always had. Her eyes stung, but she refused to look away. This was the first fragile thread Sophie had reached for since the accident, and Grace would not miss it. Valor's ears flicked once, as if he sensed her in the doorway, but he didn't rise. His head remained low, eyes half closed, content with the weight of Sophie's hand against him. Grace remembered what Hughes had said at the community center. that valor wasn't just a reminder, but a bridge. And here, in the quiet of Sophie's room, she began to believe it. The room smelled faintly of lavender from the sachets tucked into the dresser drawers. It mixed with the earthy scent of Valor's coat, grounding the space in something real, something alive. Grace's mind drifted back to the countless nights when Sophie had cried herself to sleep after Daniel's passing, only to grow silent altogether. She thought of the way she had sat in the dark, clutching the handkerchief soaked with her own tears, praying for a miracle. And now, here it was, not grand, not loud, just a girl's hand resting on a dog's back, and the steady rhythm of breathing that filled the void like a promise. Grace leaned her forehead against the doorframe, her shoulders trembling. She let herself cry quietly, not the keening sobs she had released at Daniel's graveside, but the softer kind, the kind that came with relief, with gratitude too fragile to name. She thought of what tomorrow might bring. Sophie still silent, therapy still difficult, the world still heavy. But for the first time in months, she also thought of what could grow from this moment. Perhaps words would follow touch. Perhaps laughter would follow words. And perhaps one day, her daughter's eyes would shine again, not with pain, but with light. Valor stirred, lifting his head briefly to glance toward the doorway. His amber eyes met Grace's, holding steady as though to reassure her. Then he lowered his head back onto the quilt, closer to Sophie's feet, and exhaled deeply. Grace shivered at the uncanny certainty in that gaze, as though Daniel himself had passed something of his promise into this dog. She whispered into the dark, her voice breaking but firm. "Thank you. Thank you for finding her." Sophie shifted slightly, her hand curling tighter into Valor's fur, and Grace thought she saw the faintest hint of a smile tug at the corner of her daughter's lips. It was fleeting, fragile, but it was enough to pierce the gloom. The house, once unbearable in its silence, now breathed with them. It was no longer a tomb of memories, but the beginning of something new, uncertain, unsteady, but alive. Grace remained in the doorway until her legs ached, unwilling to break the spell. At last, she whispered goodnight, though she wasn't sure if it was to Sophie, to Valor, or to Daniel's memory, lingering in the room. Then she turned off the hallway light, leaving the glow of the bedside lamp to bathe the scene in warmth. As she walked away, she realized that, for the first time in months, she was not afraid of the night ahead. She would still cry, still ache, still miss him. But she would also hope, because Sophie wasn't alone anymore, and neither was she. The morning sun crept cautiously into the kitchen, filtering through the blinds in thin ribbons of gold. Dust motes danced in the light, drifting lazily above the tiled floor. The house was still, carrying that fragile quiet that comes after months of grief, a quiet that had once felt suffocating. But today, the silence was different. It had weight, yes, but it also carried presence. Grace stood at the stove, her hands moving automatically as she cracked eggs into a pan. The faint hiss of butter meeting heat filled the air. She had made this breakfast 1,000 times. Scrambled eggs, toast, lightly browned, a few slices of fruit cut neatly on a plate. The ritual gave her something to hold on to, something ordinary in a life that no longer was. Behind her, Sophie sat at the kitchen table in her wheelchair, her posture still and her gaze fixed somewhere near the edge of the plate in front of her. She hadn't touched it yet. The pale pink blanket still draped across her legs, the daisies on her nightgown a fading echo of innocence. Beside her, Valor sat tall and steady, his dark coat glinting where the morning sun struck it. His ears twitched with every sound, the crack of an eggshell, the groan of the old refrigerator as it kicked on, the far-off rumble of a car down the street. He was alert, but not restless. His gaze swept the room in silent vigilance before returning to Sophie. Grace glanced over her shoulder and paused, spatula hovering above the pan. The image struck her like a prayer answered. Her daughter not sitting alone at the table, not adrift in silence, but flanked by a guardian. Vala's presence filled the empty chair Daniel once sat in, not replacing him, but anchoring the space he had left behind. A sudden clang broke the moment. Grace had accidentally let the spatula slip, its metal edge clattering against the skillet. Sophie flinched, her shoulders jerking upward, eyes widening in startled fear. But before Grace could murmur comfort, Vala moved. He rose in an instant, body angled slightly between Sophie and the stove, his ears pricked forward, muscles taut. His head turned toward the sound, assessing it with calm precision. Sophie's trembling stilled. Her wide eyes shifted to Vala, who stood firm beside her, his gaze unwavering. The sharp crack of fear softened in her face, replaced by something else. Trust. Her small hand reached out tentatively, brushing against his flank, feeling the solidity of him, the reassurance in his calm stance. Grace's throat tightened. It was such a small thing, the protective tilt of a dog's body, but it was everything. Sophie hadn't sought reassurance from words or from her mother's embrace. She had sought it from Vala. Grace forced a smile as she turned back to the stove, masking the tears stinging her eyes. "Just the spatula, sweetheart," she said softly, though she knew Sophie might not answer. "Nothing scary." She glanced again at the table. Sophie's hand lingered on Vala's side, even as he lowered himself back down beside her chair. His amber eyes remained trained on her, as if every breath she took was his responsibility. The eggs finished cooking, their pale yellow edges curling slightly in the heat. Grace plated them carefully, adding toast and fruit before setting the dish in front of Sophie. She set down her own plate across from her daughter, though appetite rarely followed grief. For a moment, neither of them ate. Sophie stared at the food, then at Vala, her fingers drumming lightly against the armrest of her chair. Vala nudged her arm gently with his nose, urging her forward. A faint twitch passed across Sophie's lips. Not a smile, but not the blankness Grace had grown used to either. Slowly, she picked up her fork. Grace pretended not to notice, giving her daughter the dignity of her silence. She buttered her toast and spoke casually, as though they were any other family, on any other morning. "It's sunny today. Maybe we can sit on the porch later, let the fresh air in." Sophie did not respond, but she took a bite of egg, small and hesitant. Vala's ears twitched at the sound of her fork against the plate. Grace caught the detail, filing it away like treasure. Sophie was eating without being coaxed, eating because Vala was beside her. The rhythm of the kitchen returned, fork against porcelain, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint chirp of birds outside the window. Yet every sound seemed to pass through Vala first, as though he filtered the world for danger before allowing it near Sophie. Grace leaned back in her chair, watching them, her chest tight with conflicting emotions. She wished Daniel could see this, the way Vala guarded their daughter, the way Sophie seemed to breathe a little easier in his presence. He would have understood immediately. He would have known this was healing, even if it was quiet, even if it was fragile. Her mind replayed the accident again, as it often did. The rain, the headlights, the crushing silence afterward. She clenched her hand in her lap, grounding herself. This morning was not about loss. It was about the presence sitting in their kitchen now, steady and loyal, filling the air with something living again. Sophie reached for a slice of fruit, her hand brushing Vala's ear as she moved. He tilted his head slightly, leaning into her touch. For a heartbeat, Sophie's eyes softened, and Grace could swear she saw the faintest trace of her little girl returning. The one who used to giggle when Daniel pretended to bark like a dog. The one who once filled this house with sound. Grace pressed her lips together, holding back another wave of tears. She did not want to break the spell. When breakfast ended, Sophie set her fork down carefully. She did not speak, but she turned her head toward Vala and gave his fur another long, deliberate stroke. He responded with a soft chuff of breath, curling at her feet once more. Grace cleared the plates in silence, her heart torn open in equal measure by grief and gratitude. For the first time in a long while, the kitchen did not feel like a tomb of absence. It felt like a place of beginnings, of fragile hope, stitched together by the simple act of presence. And in that moment, Grace realized something profound. Vala was not just Sophie's guardian. He was hers too. The small office smelled faintly of chamomile tea and worn leather chairs. Soft light spilled through gauzy curtains, painting pale rectangles across the carpet. This was the space Grace had been bringing Sophie to every week for nearly 4 months. And yet, it still felt foreign, like stepping into a room where hope was expected, but rarely found. Grace wheeled Sophie inside with practiced gentleness, her hand steady on the chair's handle. Sophie sat the way she always did, shoulders drawn in, hands folded loosely in her lap, eyes cast downward to avoid the world. But this time, they weren't alone. Vala padded quietly beside them, his nails clicking lightly against the tile of the reception area, before sinking into the muffled carpet of the therapy room. The shepherd moved with purpose, his body never straying more than an arm's length from Sophie's side. Grace had worried at first, unsure if the clinic would allow him inside. But the receptionist had only smiled knowingly, as if sensing something sacred in his presence. Dr. Elaine Porter, the therapist, looked up from her notepad as they entered. Her kind face softened further when she saw Vala. "So," she said gently, setting the pen aside, "this must be Vala." Grace nodded, her throat tight. He was Daniel's partner. Now he's ours." The doctor's gaze lingered on Sophie, then on the dog, who had stationed himself against her chair, sitting tall, eyes watchful. "Well," she said softly, "you're welcome here, Vala." Sophie did not look up. But Grace noticed the way her daughter's hand drifted ever so slightly, brushing against Vala's fur, as though drawing strength from the contact. The session began, much like the others. Dr. Porter's voice was calm, warm, her words an invitation rather than a demand. "How are you feeling today, Sophie?" Silence. The question hung in the air, unanswered, as so many had before. Grace sat on the edge of the chair in the corner, her hand wrapped tightly around her own wrist, fighting the urge to speak for her daughter. She had learned not to. Pressing Sophie only built thicker walls. "Doctor." Porter leaned back slightly, her eyes kind, and tried again. "It's all right. You don't have to say anything if you don't want to. Maybe you can just sit with me a little while." More silence, only the faint tick of the clock on the wall. But this time, the silence was different. Valor shifted, lowering his body until he lay stretched across Sophie's feet, his head resting lightly against the side of her shoe. Sophie's eyes flicked downward. Grace caught the movement, sharp and fleeting, but real. Her daughter's hand slid off her lap and came to rest on Valor's back. Fingers spread, stroking once, twice, slow and deliberate. Dr. Porter didn't miss it either. Her smile was subtle, her tone still steady. "I see Valor is keeping you company," she said softly. "That's nice. Dogs are very good at listening, aren't they?" Sophie's eyes lingered on the dog. No words left her lips, but Grace saw it. Her daughter's shoulders, once stiff and hunched, had loosened. Her breaths, usually shallow and uneven, now moved in slow rhythm, with Valor's steady inhale and exhale. Grace's own breath caught. She pressed her fingers against her mouth to keep from crying. She had sat through dozens of sessions where Sophie's silence felt like a verdict, where she had left with heavier despair than when she arrived. But this time was different. Sophie wasn't talking, no, but she was engaging, tethering herself to the world again through touch and breath. Dr. Porter leaned forward slightly, her voice softer still. "Grace, do you notice it?" Grace nodded quickly, her vision blurring. "Her breathing," she whispered. "It's calmer." "Exactly," the therapist replied. "She's regulating herself through Valor. That's not something we can teach with words. That's something instinct does, something connection does." Grace bit her lip, tears threatening to fall. All the months of trying, reading stories, coaxing conversation, filling silence with her own words, had failed. Yet Valor, in his quiet presence, had reached Sophie in ways no doctor, no medicine, no desperate mother could. Minutes passed, the session flowing in quiet observation. Sophie remained silent, but she stayed present, her hand on Valor, her breathing in rhythm with his. When the clock chimed softly to mark the hour, Grace almost didn't want to leave. For the first time, the silence inside the therapy room felt less like a prison and more like a shelter. Dr. Porter closed her notebook gently, her voice thoughtful. "Grace, I think Valor might be more than a companion. He may be the bridge Sophie needs to step back toward the world." The words lodged deep in Grace's chest. A bridge. She thought of Daniel, the way he had thrown himself in front of the headlights to shield their daughter. Now, somehow, his dog was doing the same. Not against a car, not against flames, but against the suffocating weight of silence. As they left the clinic, the receptionist smiled again, watching Valor pace proudly beside Sophie's chair. Outside, the afternoon air was cool, the sun slanting low behind the buildings. Grace opened the car door, helping Sophie in, then guiding Valor into the seat beside her. She slid into the driver's seat, resting her hands on the wheel, but her eyes lingered in the rearview mirror. Sophie sat with her head tilted slightly toward Valor, her hand still in his fur. Her chest rose and fell in steady rhythm, no longer jagged, no longer rushed. Grace exhaled, a long breath she hadn't realized she was holding. For months, she had wondered if her daughter was gone behind walls too thick to break through. Now she understood. Sophie wasn't gone. She had simply been waiting for someone who didn't need words, who could meet her in silence and still understand. And in that moment, Grace whispered a truth to herself that she could never say aloud in the therapy room. "Daniel, you gave her back to me. Through him." The house lay in silence, cloaked in the fragile stillness that comes only after midnight. Outside, the wind pressed gently against the windows, rattling the branches of the oak tree in the front yard. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen, a soft and steady background note. Beyond that, there was nothing, just the heavy quiet that had haunted the Bennett home since Daniel's absence. Grace sat curled on the living room couch, a blanket draped loosely around her shoulders, her eyes burning from the weight of another sleepless night. A book lay open on her lap, unread. She had tried to distract herself, to push her mind away from the ache of memories and the gnawing fear for her daughter, but the words blurred into meaningless shapes. The only sound that truly reached her came from upstairs, the faint, rhythmic breathing of Valor, ever near Sophie's bed. She rose finally, the floor cool against her bare feet, and moved down the hallway to her daughter's room. The door was ajar, spilling a thin slice of light from the night lamp onto the carpet. Grace leaned her shoulder against the frame, her hand pressed to the wood as though she needed to steady herself before crossing into the space. Inside, Sophie stirred restlessly beneath the quilt. Her small frame shifted, her legs twitching faintly despite their stillness in waking hours. A whimper escaped her lips, a sound Grace hadn't heard in months. It wasn't speech, not quite, but it wasn't silence either. It was a crack, a fracture in the dam that had held Sophie's voice hostage since that night. Valor lifted his head instantly. His ears pricked, and his eyes glowed softly in the dim light. With deliberate care, he rose from the foot of the bed and climbed closer, pressing his weight against the side of Sophie's body. He lowered his head until it rested gently on her lap, anchoring her with warmth and steady breath. Sophie's hands, tangled in the quilt, loosened. One slipped out, fingers brushing against the shepherd's fur. She did not wake fully. Instead, she mumbled, fragments of words, broken pieces of memory, slipping free in her sleep. Daddy. Car. Dark. Grace's breath caught in her throat. She pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, stifling a sob. For months, she had begged the universe for any sound, any syllable from her daughter's lips. Now, even these fragments felt like miracles. Painful miracles, yes, but miracles all the same. Sophie's head turned slightly, her cheek brushing Valor's ear. Don't. Leave me, she whispered, voice cracking like porcelain under pressure. Valor's body tensed, not with alarm, but with focus. His tail gave a small, slow thump against the mattress, as if to answer without words. I'm here. I won't leave. Grace pressed herself deeper into the doorway, her tears spilling freely. She wanted to rush forward, to gather Sophie into her arms and tell her she was safe. But she knew better. Her daughter had closed herself to the world of words and touch since Daniel's death. It was Valor who was allowed into that inner space now. It was Valor who could cross the threshold without breaking her. So Grace stood still, bearing witness. She listened as Sophie's breaths steadied, as the fragments of nightmares gave way to softer murmurs. Her daughter's hand curled into Valor's fur, gripping it with a quiet desperation, and slowly, the tension in her face eased. Grace could almost hear Daniel's voice then, whispering in the dark. She's strong, Grace. She'll find her way back. Just give her time. The ache in her chest deepened, but so did her hope. Minutes stretched into something softer. The house seemed to exhale, the weight of grief lifting just enough to allow space for something new. Sophie's breathing grew even, matching Valor's. Their rhythm was the same, two lives bound by silence and loss, holding each other steady in ways Grace could not. Grace pressed a kiss against her fingers and lifted them toward the room, a small gesture of blessing, of gratitude, before pulling back. She didn't want to disturb them. She wanted this moment to belong wholly to Sophie and her guardian. As she stepped back into the hallway, Grace leaned her head against the wall and let her tears flow. They were not only tears of sorrow, they were tears of relief, of recognition. She had just seen it. A crack forming in the fortress of silence that had imprisoned her daughter. Small, fragile, but real. And through that crack, with Valor's quiet presence, Grace believed light might one day return. The afternoon sun stretched across the park in long golden lines, warming the earth after weeks of chill. A soft breeze carried the fragrance of tulips and freshly cut grass, mingling with the faint sweetness of blooming cherry trees. Children's laughter rang through the open space, light and unburdened, as kites tugged against strings, and parents called from benches shaded by budding branches. For most families, it was an ordinary spring day. For Grace, it was something heavier, layered with a bittersweet ache. She guided Sophie's wheelchair slowly along the path, her free hand resting lightly on the handle, while her daughter's pale fingers clutched a small packet of animal-shaped cookies in her lap. Sophie sat still, her face half lit by the afternoon glow. She hadn't spoken since the ceremony. Not again. Not in full. Just that one whispered word. Valor. It had been a miracle. But miracles, Grace had learned, rarely arrived in a flood. They came like drops, precious and fleeting. Valor trotted beside them, his gait easy but alert. His ears flicked at the sound of every squealing child, every distant bark, every jogger's footfall on the gravel path. His eyes, though, stayed close to Sophie, as if his world had narrowed to the small girl in the chair and the soft packet of cookies she gripped. Grace inhaled deeply, letting the scent of lilacs brush against her memory. Daniel had loved this park. He used to bring Sophie here after long shifts, lifting her high onto his shoulders as they walked past the pond. She had squealed with delight when ducks rushed toward breadcrumbs scattered on the water, her father's laughter mingling with hers. That memory cut sharp now, a reminder of everything absent, everything that would never be again. Ahead, children tumbled down the grassy hill, their cheeks flushed, their joy unrestrained. A group of girls skipped rope, their chants echoing in rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 4. Each sound pressed against Grace's heart, highlighting the stillness of the chair she pushed. Sophie's face didn't move. She watched the children but didn't smile, didn't frown, just watched. The packet of cookies rustled faintly as Sophie's fingers shifted. She opened it carefully, taking out one shaped like a bear, holding it between thumb and forefinger, as though unsure what to do with it. Valor noticed immediately, his head tilted, ears pricked. His amber eyes locked on the cookie, but he didn't move closer. He waited. Sophie's gaze flicked down at him, the faintest trace of awareness. She broke the cookie in half, crumbs scattering onto the blanket across her lap, and held one piece out. Valor stepped closer, lowering his head, and took it gently from her fingers. Grace's chest tightened. It was such a small act, so ordinary. But the sight of Sophie giving something, initiating a gesture, sharing rather than withdrawing, broke something loose inside her. She blinked hard against the tears, afraid that if she let herself cry too loudly, the fragile thread binding Sophie to the world in this moment might snap. They moved farther down the path, past the playground where swings creaked in the breeze. A boy raced past on a scooter, the wheels clattering against the concrete. Valor shifted instantly, moving closer to Sophie's chair, body angled protectively between her and the noise. Sophie startled, flinching at the sudden sound, but when her eyes darted to Valor, she relaxed. Her hand reached out again, brushing his back in a gesture that was becoming a habit. The air buzzed with life. chirping sparrows, the metallic jingle of an ice cream cart, the calls of parents urging caution. But around Sophie, the world moved slower. The stillness of her chair contrasted painfully with the constant motion around her, a reminder of what she had lost and what she had yet to reclaim. Grace's steps slowed, her gaze fixed on her daughter's profile. Sophie's lips parted slightly, as though a thought hovered there, but no sound came, only silence. Grace wanted to kneel beside her to whisper the words she carried in her heart. "It's okay to smile, sweetheart. It's okay to be here, even if he isn't." But she said nothing. She had learned that words could sometimes feel like stones, too heavy, too much, so she let the moment be. They reached the pond. Ducks glided across the water, their ripples catching the sunlight. Sophie's fingers tightened on another cookie. She crumbled it slowly, scattering the pieces onto the ground near the edge. Ducks waddled closer, quacking softly as they pecked at the crumbs. Vala remained seated beside her chair, eyes following every bird but body still, as if understanding this was Sophie's moment, not his. Grace stood behind them, her hand pressing lightly against the wheelchair handle, her eyes damp. She remembered Daniel's shoulders beneath her daughter's small hands, Sophie's giggles echoing across the pond. The memory pierced, but it also warmed. She let herself imagine, for one fragile heartbeat, that he was still there, just beyond the sunlight, watching their little girl share cookies with ducks and dogs alike. The wind lifted, carrying the sound of more laughter down the hill. Sophie's eyes followed the noise. Her hand stilled on the empty cookie packet, and for just a second, her lips curved. Not a full smile, not even enough to be certain, but Grace saw it. A twitch, a spark. She felt her heart rise. Vala nudged Sophie's hand gently, as if confirming what Grace had seen. The shepherd's tail gave a slow, contented sway. Grace closed her eyes briefly, whispering in her mind the words she would never say aloud in front of Sophie. "Daniel, she's still here. She's finding her way back." When she opened them again, the sun had shifted lower, bathing the park in amber light. The children's laughter continued, bright and unstoppable. But for Grace, what mattered was the stillness by her side, a stillness that was no longer only emptiness, but the beginning of fragile trust, stitched together by cookies, sunlight, and the quiet devotion of a German shepherd named Vala. The park had settled into that hushed lull that comes in the late afternoon, when the sun begins to slip lower and shadows stretch long across the grass. The children who had filled the air with laughter earlier were now scattering home, their voices fading like echoes of a happier world. Grace pushed Sophie's wheelchair slowly along the winding path back toward the parking lot, Vala pacing steadily at their side. It should have been peaceful. It should have been ordinary. But peace, Grace was learning, was fragile. The sound came suddenly, an explosion of barking, sharp and guttural, tearing through the quiet. Grace's head snapped to the right, just in time to see a blur of motion. From behind a hedge, a large dog burst into view, its fur ragged, its eyes wild. Its leash trailed uselessly behind it, the clasp broken, the owner's voice far away and panicked. The animal barreled toward them, teeth bared, growl low and savage. Grace's heart lurched. She froze, hands tightening around Sophie's wheelchair handles. Her first instinct was to pull her daughter back, to run, but there was nowhere to go. The path was narrow, flanked by benches and hedges, trapping them in. "Dear God," she whispered, her voice trembling. Sophie's eyes widened, her lips parting in silent terror. The packet of cookies slid from her lap, scattering animal-shaped crumbs onto the pavement. Valor moved before Grace could even think. The German shepherd lunged forward, his growl deep and resonant, vibrating through the air like thunder rolling across the hills. His body coiled, muscles rippling as he planted himself between Sophie and the charging dog. His hackles rose, his teeth bared, not in panic, but in defiance. The clash came in a blur of fur and sound. The stray lunged, snapping. Valor met it head-on, teeth flashing, bodies colliding with a thud that reverberated through the ground. The growls were primal, visceral, echoing through the nearly empty park. Grace screamed, pushing Sophie's chair back as far as the narrow path allowed. Her hands shook violently on the handles, her mind caught between terror for the child she couldn't shield and the dog who was shielding her instead. Sophie didn't scream. She sat rigid, frozen, her wide eyes locked on Valor. Her hands clutched the armrests of her chair, knuckles pale. Her breathing came in sharp bursts, but she didn't cry out. She just watched the shepherd fight for her. Valor's body struck against the stray's, twisting, shoving it away from the wheelchair. The stray snapped back, claws scraping against the pavement. Valor countered, his growl low and commanding, his body braced like a wall that would not give way. The two dogs circled, a whirl of fur and fury. Teeth clashed, snarls tore through the air, and Grace's heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst. She wanted to run forward, to drag Valor away, to do something, but instinct screamed at her to stay back, to keep Sophie behind her. Then it happened, too fast to stop. The stray lunged sideways, teeth catching Valor's front leg. A sharp yelp cut through the chaos, piercing Grace's chest like a blade. Valor stumbled, but only for a heartbeat. Then he surged back, twisting, forcing the stray down with a ferocity born not of anger, but of duty. His growl deepened, resonant and unyielding. The stray faltered. With a final snap, Valor drove it back, his stance immovable. The ragged animal's ears flattened, its growls turned to whines, and at last it turned tail, bolting across the grass, leash trailing like a flag of defeat. Silence crashed down in its wake. Only the sound of Grace's ragged breathing filled the space, mingling with Sophie's quick, shallow gasps. Valor stood in the middle of the path, chest heaving, his leg trembling where crimson stained his fur. His body remained angled toward where the stray had vanished, as if unwilling to trust that the danger was truly gone. Then, slowly, he turned back toward Sophie. Her wide eyes locked with his, unblinking. And then, as if pulled by something deeper than fear, her hand lifted. It shook, hesitated in the air, but then extended toward him. Valor limped closer, lowering himself beside her chair, despite the wound. He pressed his head against her lap, his weight solid, grounding. Sophie's hand landed gently on his head, fingers threading into his fur, clinging like an anchor. Grace stumbled forward, falling to her knees beside them. Tears poured freely down her face as her hands hovered, trembling between reaching for her daughter and reaching for Valor. She couldn't choose. Both were her family now. Both had nearly been lost. Sophie's lips moved. No sound came at first, just a breath, just the bare tremble of words unformed. Then, softly, broken but clear, a whisper slipped into the air. Valor. It was not the hollow call from the ceremony. It was not a word of memory. It was a word of gratitude, of recognition, spoken through tears that had not yet fallen. Grace clutched her chest, her sobs breaking into the cool air. She reached finally, her hands resting on both her daughter's shoulder and Vala's back. "It's all right," she whispered through tears. "He's here. He's with us." The park, once filled with laughter, now held only this tableau: a mother on her knees, a child in a chair, and a wounded shepherd whose loyalty had cut through fear itself. And in that fragile, trembling silence, Grace understood something she could never have put into words. Daniel had saved Sophie once with his own body. Now, Vala has done the same. His loyalty was not just memory. It was living, breathing, and fiercely unbreakable. The ride home was heavy with silence, broken only by the hum of the tires on the road, and Vala's steady breathing in the back seat. Grace kept glancing into the rearview mirror, her stomach knotted. Sophie sat in her chair, blanket tucked around her legs, her face pale and distant. Beside her, Valor rested his head against her lap, his fur matted with blood from the gash on his front leg. Grace's fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly. Every time her eyes caught the dark stains spreading along Vala's coat, she felt her throat tighten. He had taken the blow for Sophie, shielded her with his body, and now he bore the wound quietly, without complaint. She whispered a prayer under her breath, half to God, half to Daniel, that the injury was not more serious than it looked. When they arrived home, the evening had already draped itself across the neighborhood. The porch light flickered to life as Grace guided Sophie inside. Vala followed, limping slightly, but his eyes stayed fixed on the little girl, as if he refused to falter until she was safe within the walls of their home. Grace fetched the first aid kit from the bathroom, her hands trembling. She had patched scraped knees before, kissed away bruises. But this was different. This was blood that had been spilled to protect what was most precious to her. When she returned to the living room, Sophie was already leaning forward in her chair, her eyes locked on Vala with an intensity Grace had never seen before. "Sweetheart," Grace whispered gently, kneeling beside her. "Let me take care of this. It's just a scratch, but it needs cleaning." To her astonishment, Sophie shook her head. Her lips parted, and though no sound came at first, she pushed the words out with effort, her voice hoarse from months of silence. I'll do it." Grace froze. The air seemed to stop moving around her. Sophie's voice, small, fragile but real, had filled the room for the first time since that night. Tears blurred Grace's vision as she nodded quickly, fumbling to place the kit on Sophie's lap. "All right, sweetheart. All right. I'll help you." Vala lay down obediently in front of Sophie's chair, lowering his head as if he understood what was about to happen. His amber eyes softened, patient, steady. Sophie's hands shook as she opened the kit. Gauze, antiseptic wipes, a roll of bandage. She picked them up one by one, her small fingers trembling so badly that Grace almost stepped in. But she didn't. She forced herself to sit back, to let Sophie lead. "Easy," Grace whispered, her voice thick. "Just go slowly." Sophie's breath came in shallow bursts as she reached down, pressing a trembling hand against Vala's fur. He didn't flinch. He stayed utterly still, his gaze never leaving hers. It was as though he understood that this was not just about the wound. It was about something far deeper. Carefully, Sophie wiped the blood away. Her hand faltered at first, then grew steadier with each stroke. The antiseptic stung, and Vala let out a faint whine, but he didn't pull away. Sophie gasped softly, tears filling her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. Grace covered her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. Those 2 words, spoken aloud, to someone other than herself, were like the cracking open of a door she had feared would remain locked forever. Sophie pressed the gauze gently against the wound, her lips trembling. She wrapped the bandage with care, her small fingers fumbling, but determined. Valor's breathing stayed even, his body relaxed beneath her touch. He was giving her his trust, giving her the chance to give back. When the bandage was finally secure, Sophie dropped the roll of tape into her lap. Her shoulders shook. She bent forward, her arms wrapping tightly around Valor's neck, pressing her face into his fur. And then she said it. "Thank you." The words came out broken, strangled with tears, but they were unmistakable. They filled the living room, fragile yet powerful. The first words Sophie had spoken to anyone since Daniel's death. Grace's knees gave out. She sank onto the carpet, her face buried in her hands, sobbing openly. Months of silence had cracked in a single moment, because of Valor. Sophie held on to the shepherd like he was the only thing keeping her tethered to the world. Valor pressed closer, his head nestled against her shoulder, his tail giving one slow, reassuring thump against the floor. Grace crawled closer, wrapping her arms around both of them, her tears dampening Sophie's hair. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered through sobs. "Thank you. Thank you." For a long time, none of them moved. The house, once filled with suffocating silence, now carried the sound of quiet weeping and the steady heartbeat of a dog who had given more than anyone could have asked. The moment felt like a turning point, fragile but undeniable. Sophie had spoken, not to her mother, not to a doctor, but to the one who had proven with his body what words could never promise, that she was safe, that she was worth saving. Grace lifted her head at last, brushing Sophie's hair back from her damp cheeks. She kissed her forehead, her voice breaking. "Your daddy would be so proud of you." Sophie didn't answer. She didn't need to. She simply held Valor tighter, her fingers curled into his fur, as if she would never let go. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Grace allowed herself to believe that healing, slow, painful, imperfect, had begun. The house had fallen into its usual nighttime stillness. Cicadas hummed outside, and Sophie's small nightlight cast a golden glow across her room. Valor lay curled on the floor by her bed, ears twitching, as though still on duty. Grace lingered by the door, listening to the silence that had once suffocated the house. Then came a whisper, so faint, she thought she imagined it. "Do you miss him too?" Inside, Sophie's trembling voice grew steadier as she looked at Valor. "Daddy, do you miss Daddy?" Valor lifted his head, resting his chin on the mattress, amber eyes meeting hers with unspoken patience. Memories spilled out. Animal cookies shaped like elephants, his laugh, his songs during thunderstorms. Sophie reached for Valor, stroking his fur as she confessed, "He told me you'd watch me if he couldn't." "And you did." Grace pressed her hand to her mouth, tears streaming. Sophie was speaking of Daniel at last, her silence cracking open. When the memory of the accident caught in Sophie's throat, she buried her face in Valor's neck. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. Valor pressed closer, steady and warm, his quiet whine telling her she wasn't alone. Grace longed to rush in, but she knew this moment belonged to Sophie and the dog who had unlocked her words. Sophie whispered once more, "Do you miss him too?" Valor answered with a soft nuzzle, and a fragile smile appeared on her face. "I knew you did." She drifted to sleep with her fingers tangled in his fur, whispering, Thank you." By morning, the house felt lighter. Sophie curled on the couch beneath a blanket while Valor sprawled nearby, his breathing steady. Grace, knitting in the rocking chair, watched them with cautious hope. The storm that once shadowed their home had begun to lift, not by her hand, not by doctors, but by Valor, the silent guardian who gave Sophie her voice back. Valor stirred, stretching out his massive body, then rose with a groggy shake. He gave a loud snort and padded clumsily across the room. Perhaps it was the sunbeam catching his eye, or perhaps he simply wanted to amuse himself. But he stopped, twisted awkwardly, and began chasing his tail in tight circles. Round and round he spun, his back legs skidding against the polished wood. At one point, he miscalculated and bumped squarely into the side table, sending a magazine sliding to the floor. He stopped, blinked in confusion, then barked once at the table as if it had wronged him. Grace's eyes widened in surprise, but before she could react, she heard it. Light, bright, and almost musical. A laugh. Sophie's laugh. It burst from her suddenly, bubbling out as if it had been waiting for years to escape. She pressed her hands to her mouth, as though startled by her own sound, but she couldn't stop the giggles spilling through her fingers. Her eyes shone, cheeks pink, with the rare, unguarded joy. Grace froze in her chair, the knitting needle slipping from her hands onto the carpet with a muted clatter. She could hardly breathe. It was the sound she had thought she might never hear again, the sound of her daughter's laughter. Her throat tightened and tears welled unbidden in her eyes. Sophie's small shoulders shook as she tried to stifle her giggles, but Valor wasn't finished. As if sensing her delight, he spun again, this time faster, his big paws slipping so dramatically that he toppled sideways into the couch. His nose nudged Sophie's knee, and she squealed with laughter so pure it seemed to fill every corner of the house. The sound pierced through Grace's chest, breaking something open inside her. For months she had carried the unbearable silence, the empty nights when Sophie's voice was locked behind walls of grief. And now, here it was again, innocent, alive, unshackled. Grace covered her mouth with trembling hands, trying not to sob and scare Sophie. But tears streamed freely down her face. Sophie finally collapsed backward onto the cushions, giggling uncontrollably as Valor leapt up beside her, tail wagging like a flag in a storm. He leaned down, tongue lolling, and licked her cheek with a great sloppy swipe. Sophie squealed louder, her voice high and happy, pushing against his broad chest. "Stop! That's gross!" she cried between bursts of laughter. Grace's knees gave way, and she sank to the floor, still hidden partly by the armchair. She pressed her forehead into her palms, her body shaking with a mix of grief and gratitude. She was hearing Sophie, not the whisper of trauma, not the muted fragments of memory, but the laughter of her little girl. The laughter she had once thought gone forever, buried with Daniel. When she dared to look up, Sophie was clutching Valor's neck, her face flushed with joy. It wasn't just a fleeting laugh. It was a full embrace of the moment, a spark of the child she had been before the world broke. Grace whispered, barely audible, "Thank you. Thank you, God." Her vision blurred again with tears, but she didn't move closer. She didn't want to break the magic unfolding before her eyes. She just sat there, watching her daughter smile, and let the sound of Sophie's laughter stitch something back together inside her heart. Valor finally flopped down beside Sophie, panting from the effort, his tail still thumping against the couch. Sophie, breathless, nestled against him, one hand buried in his fur. She looked smaller than ever, But at that moment she also looked lighter. After a long pause, Sophie glanced toward the doorway, almost as if she knew her mother was listening. Their eyes met briefly, Grace's wet with tears, Sophie's still glowing from laughter. For a second, Sophie didn't retreat, didn't hide. She simply let the smile linger on her lips before burying her face back into Valor's side. Grace pressed her hand to her chest, whispering again, "She's coming back. My little girl is coming back." And in the quiet aftermath of that laughter, the house no longer felt like a mausoleum. It felt like a home again. The small therapy room smelled faintly of lavender and wood polish, designed to feel less like a clinic and more like a sanctuary. Soft light filtered through sheer curtains, painting the walls with a quiet glow. A round rug lay in the center, scattered with a few toys and puzzles, meant to welcome children into conversation without pressure. Grace sat stiffly in the corner chair, her hands laced together so tightly her knuckles were white. Beside her, Valor settled down with a heavy sigh, his thick fur pressed against Sophie's small leg, as though anchoring her in place. Sophie sat on the couch opposite the therapist, her body folded in on itself, fingers twisting the hem of her sleeve. She hadn't spoken here before. Every visit until now had been marked by silence, broken only by the faint sound of her breathing, or the occasional shifting of her shoes against the floor. Dr. Patel, the therapist, leaned forward slightly, her voice steady and calm. "Good morning, Sophie. It's nice to see you again." Sophie didn't look up, but her shoulders didn't flinch the way they used to. Valor nudged her knee, and she placed a hand on his head, absently running her fingers through his fur. Grace watched that small movement, her heart aching with both fear and fragile hope. Dr. Patel set a coloring book on the low table between them. "You don't have to talk if you don't want to. But sometimes colors can say things our mouths aren't ready to." She smiled gently. "Would you like to pick one?" For a moment, the room was silent, except for the faint hum of the air conditioner. Then Sophie reached forward, her hand trembling slightly, and chose a blue crayon. She bent her head and began shading softly, her movements deliberate. Dr. Patel let her color in peace, only speaking after several minutes. "That's a very calming color," she observed. "Blue can mean a lot of things, sometimes sadness, sometimes peace. What does it mean to you, Sophie?" Sophie's hand paused, her lips parted as if to form a word, then closed again. Valor, sensing her hesitation, rested his chin on her knee. A soft whisper broke through the silence. "Safe." Grace's breath caught audibly, and her hand flew to her mouth. It was the first time Sophie had answered a direct question in therapy. Dr. Patel's expression softened, but she didn't rush. She simply nodded, as though Sophie's voice were the most natural sound in the world. "Safe," she repeated. "That's a very important word." She glanced briefly at Valor. "Do you feel safe when Valor is with you?" Sophie hesitated again, but this time her voice came a little stronger. "Yes." Her small hand curled into Valor's fur, clutching him like a lifeline. Grace blinked rapidly, her vision blurring. She had prayed for this, just one step, one word, and now it was happening right in front of her. Dr. Patel leaned back, her tone gentle but encouraging. "Sophie, can I ask you something else?" Sophie nodded faintly, eyes still fixed on the coloring page. "What do you think has helped you feel brave enough to use your voice today?" The question hung in the air. Sophie's crayon stilled completely. For a moment, Grace feared the silence would return, that the fragile progress might vanish like a mirage. Then Sophie whispered, so softly Grace almost didn't catch it. "Because I'm not alone anymore." The words were like sunlight breaking through heavy clouds. Grace pressed her fist to her lips to keep from sobbing aloud. Dr. Patel's eyes flickered with quiet triumph, though her voice remained calm. "That's a beautiful answer, Sophie. No one should have to feel alone. And you're right. You're not." She gestured toward Valor, then to Grace. "You have him. You have your mom. You have me too. You're not alone." Sophie finally lifted her gaze, just briefly, toward her mother. Grace's heart cracked wide open at the sight. Those wide, haunted eyes carrying the faintest glimmer of trust. She wanted to rush forward, gather Sophie in her arms, and weep into her hair. But she stayed still, knowing the moment belonged to her daughter and the fragile steps she was taking. Dr. Patel smiled. "Would you like to tell Valor anything today?" "You don't have to, but sometimes talking to him can feel easier than talking to me." Sophie turned her face toward the dog, her lips trembling. Valor's tail thumped once against the rug, as if he understood. Sophie leaned down, pressing her forehead lightly to his. "Don't leave me," she whispered. Valor licked her chin in response, earning the faintest curve of a smile from Sophie. Grace could no longer hold back her tears. They spilled silently down her cheeks as she clutched her chest, her whole body trembling. It wasn't a full recovery, not yet, but it was a beginning. The wall Sophie had built around herself had cracked, and through it, light was beginning to seep in. When the session ended, Grace reached for her daughter's hand as they walked out. To her astonishment, Sophie didn't pull away. Her small fingers rested in her mother's palm, tentative but real. Outside, the spring air was sweet, and the sound of birds filled the sky. Grace tightened her grip gently, whispering a prayer of gratitude. Healing was beginning, not in leaps, but in the fragile steps of whispered words and quiet courage. And it all started with the simple truth Sophie had found. She was not alone anymore. The school loomed ahead, red brick glowing in the morning light. For most children, it was routine. For Sophie, it felt like a battlefield. She clutched her mother's hand until her knuckles turned pale. At her other side, Valor walked steady, the words, "service dog," stitched across his black harness. Grace knelt at the door, smoothing her daughter's hair. "Remember, he's with you every step. You're not alone." Sophie looked into Valor's calm amber eyes, placed a hand on his head, and drew her first deep breath of the day. Inside, the hallway buzzed, lockers slamming, laughter echoing. Whispers rippled as Sophie walked past. "Whoa, she brought a dog," someone murmured. Her throat tightened, but Valor pressed against her leg, his presence anchoring her. At the classroom door, Mrs. Fletcher greeted them warmly. "Good morning, Sophie." "Good morning, Valor." The dog wagged once, and Sophie managed a small nod. Inside, children stared, eager to ask questions. One girl leaned forward. "Can I pet him?" Mrs. Fletcher raised her hand. "Remember what we talked about? Valor is working. He's here to help Sophie." A disappointed "oh" drifted across the room, but Sophie slipped quietly into her seat. Valor settled beneath her desk, his head resting across her shoes like a shield. For the first time, Sophie didn't feel entirely exposed. The mountain of noise, the chatter, the shuffle of feet, pressed against her, but Valor's steady breathing made it bearable. When a pencil clattered loudly to the floor, she flinched, breath snagging in her throat. Instantly, Valor pressed closer, his tail brushing her ankle. Sophie's hand found his fur, trembling, easing. At recess, children swarmed with curiosity. Does he know tricks? Does he bark at bad guys? Sophie stayed silent, fingers wrapped in Valor's harness. Then one girl spoke softly. He's really lucky to have you. Sophie blinked, startled. The thought lingered. Maybe people saw not just her silence, but Valor's strength too. On the bench, away from the games, Sophie pulled out her sketchbook. She drew Valor first, strong, sharp-eared, his coat dark like a mask. Then she added another figure, taller, broad-shouldered, in uniform. Her father. She sketched his hand resting against Valor's back. A circle began to form. Protectors who had kept her world from unraveling. Do you miss him too? She whispered into the wind. Valor shifted at her voice, pressing closer. Sophie shaded the lines slowly, adding a faint smile to her father's face. A boy darted past, pausing just long enough to glance at her page. Whoa, that's your dog. He looks awesome. Sophie froze, cheeks flushing. And the boy ran off, but Valor lifted his head proudly. Sophie bent closer to him, whispering, It's us. It wasn't much, but it was more than silence. Back in the classroom, Sophie sat in the second row, notebook open. Valor lay still at her feet, already part of the rhythm of the room. When Mr. Carter read aloud and asked a question, her gaze lingered gently on Sophie. The boy was lonely, Sophie whispered, voice shaky but audible. The class stilled, surprised. Ms. Carter's smile grew. Yes. And why do you think that? Sophie's heart raced, but Valor's flank pressed steady against her shoes. Because he wanted someone to stay. For a beat, the room held its breath. Then Mrs. Carter nodded softly. Beautifully said. The lesson moved on, but something had shifted. Beneath the desk, Sophie nudged Valor's side with her foot, her quiet thank you. That afternoon, while children lined up for dismissal, Mrs. Carter scribbled a note. Dear Mrs. Brooks, today. Sophie spoke in class. Her words moved all of us. I see her courage growing each day, and I believe Valor has become a bridge for her healing. You must be very proud. She slipped the note into Sophie's backpack. At home, Grace found it among crayons and worksheets. Her breath caught as she read, tears spilling freely. Valor nudged her hand, and she buried her face in his fur. You did this, she whispered. You both did this. Sophie appeared in the doorway, clutching her sketchbook. Grace's smile trembled through her tears. Your teacher told me. You spoke in class. Sophie froze, face flushed. For a moment, silence threatened again. But Valor pressed against her legs, and she whispered, almost inaudible. He makes me brave. Grace pulled her close, wrapping arms around both daughter and dog. For the first time in months, hope felt real. That night, when Sophie slept, Valor at her feet, Grace sat at the table with the note before her. She traced the words, whispering into the quiet. Thank you, Daniel. She's finding her way back. And thank you, Valor, for being her courage when mine wasn't enough. Outside, the wind stirred the leaves. Valor lifted his head, ears twitching, as though he'd heard. Healing wasn't just possible. It was happening. The morning broke quiet and grey, as though even the sky remembered. A veil of mist hung low, softening the edges of the town. Grace woke early, her hands careful as she tied a bouquet of lilies, Daniel's favorite. Beside her, Sophie gathered a few wildflowers, pressing them into a ribbon-tied bundle. Valor waited by the door, his amber eyes solemn, his posture steady, as though he already knew where they were going. The drive to the cemetery was silent. Sophie clutched her sketchbook to her chest, watching the blur of trees. Grace kept her hands firm on the wheel, though her breath betrayed her. Valor rested with his head between the seats, a quiet presence holding them together. The cemetery stretched wide and still, rows of stones glistening with morning dew. They walked slowly, Sophie's hand tucked into Grace's, Valor pacing at their side. Beneath the oak tree, Daniel's name stood carved in stone. Grace knelt, brushing away fallen leaves, tracing the cold letters of Sergeant Daniel Brooks. Sophie crouched beside her, laying the ribbon-tied flowers at the base. Valor lowered himself into the earth, ears back, his gaze fixed on the stone in reverence. For a long moment, silence ruled. Only the whisper of leaves above, and a lone bird singing somewhere in the distance. Then Sophie's voice broke the quiet, trembling, but steady. "I'm strong because of you," she whispered, her hand pressed against the granite. "You gave me valor. You told me to be brave, and I'm trying. I promise." Valor shifted, resting his head gently against her knee. Sophie's small fingers slid into his fur, her shoulders straightening as though lifted by unseen hands. Grace's chest ached. She reached for her daughter's back, her voice low. "He would be so proud of you, of us both." The mist began to break, sunlight pouring through the oak branches, warm gold spilling over the stone. Sophie leaned against Grace and whispered, "I think he heard me." Grace kissed her hair. "I know he did." When they left, Sophie touched the stone one last time. Valor rose smoothly and walked beside them, his shadow stretching long across the gravel path. Grace realized they weren't leaving Daniel behind. They were carrying him forward. That evening, the house was quiet. Grace folded laundry, the hum of the dryer steady in the background. From down the hall, she heard a faint scratch of pencil. Slow, careful, intentional. Curious, she moved toward Sophie's room. The door was ajar. Inside, Sophie sat at her desk under the warm glow of a lamp. A sheet of paper lay before her, filled with uneven lines of handwriting. At the top, in big letters, it said, "Dear Dad." Valor lay at her feet, eyes half closed but alert, as if guarding this moment. Grace pressed against the doorframe, breath catching as she realized what she was seeing. Sophie's lips moved as she wrote, whispering the words into the silence. "I miss you every day." Today at school, I answered a question out loud, and my teacher smiled at me. Valor was under my desk the whole time, and I wasn't scared. I think you would be proud. Grace's eyes burned. For so long she had prayed her daughter would find her voice again. And here it was, spilling onto paper like water breaking through a dam. When Sophie finished, she folded the letter carefully and placed it in a shoebox tucked at the corner of her desk. Grace noticed it wasn't empty. Inside were other folded pages, dozens of letters, all addressed to Daniel. Sophie closed the lid gently, resting her palm on top as if sealing them with love. Valor nudged her knee. She bent and whispered into his fur, "Thanks for staying with me." Grace covered her mouth, tears slipping free. She wanted to rush in, to hold Sophie, but Valor lifted his head and looked at her, steady, knowing. His gaze seemed to say, "Let her be. This is her way." Grace stayed in the doorway, silent, watching her daughter find her own bridge between grief and healing. Later that night, when Sophie slept with Vala curled faithfully at her side, Grace sat in the living room. She clutched one of Daniel's old flannel shirts against her chest. The fabric was soft from years of wear, but it still carried something of him, or maybe just the memory. She buried her face in it, and the sobs came hard. "Why did you leave me, Daniel?" she whispered through tears. "How am I supposed to do this alone? To raise her, to heal her, when I can't even heal myself?" The words broke into raw, choking sobs. She pressed the shirt against her face as though she could drag him back into existence. Then came the sound. Soft paw steps across the hardwood. Grace lifted her head. Vala stood in the doorway, amber eyes fixed on her. She whispered, "Go back to her. She needs you." But Vala didn't move. Slowly, he padded across the room, stopped in front of her, and pressed his head firmly into her lap. Grace gasped. The weight, the warmth, the insistence. It broke something inside her. She dropped the shirt and buried her hands into his thick fur, sobbing anew. "I can't do this," she cried. "Every day feels like a battle I'm losing. Sophie's stronger than I am. And I'm just—" Her voice dissolved into silence. Vala stayed pressed against her, unmoving, his breath calm and steady. And in that presence, Grace felt something stir. A flicker of memory. The way Daniel used to hold her when she broke, how he would steady her without words. Her throat tightened. She brushed her hand over Vala's ears. "Is this you?" she whispered into the stillness. "Are you here through him?" The dog's tail thumped once against the floor, soft but certain. Grace let herself believe it, just for a moment, that Daniel's love remained, carried in this loyal guardian. Her sobs eased into trembling breaths. "Thank you," she whispered, stroking Vala's fur, "for staying, for carrying a piece of him back to us." Vala lifted his head, nudging her chin until her eyes met his. In his gaze, steady and unblinking, Grace felt less alone. She leaned back into the couch, Vala's head still heavy on her lap. "He trusted you with us, didn't he? To protect her, to protect me, to remind us he's not really gone." Vala closed his eyes, his chest rising and falling with quiet assurance. Grace rested her hand on his side, letting the silence settle. Not healing, not yet, but a beginning. Upstairs, Sophie stirred in her sleep, shifting slightly, but never waking. She was safe. For tonight, they all were. Grace pressed her hand against her chest, whispering into the quiet. "I think I can keep going, Daniel. Not alone. Never alone." The house was still, but it no longer felt empty. The morning sun poured through the classroom windows, turning the edges of Sophie's notebook golden. Vala lay curled beneath her desk, his steady breathing a quiet shield. Everything seemed calm, until the fire alarm split the air. A piercing wail shrieked overhead, red strobes flashing against the walls. To most children, it was routine. To Sophie, it was sirens all over again. The night her father never came home. Her chest locked. She clamped her palms over her ears, folding into herself, breath stolen by panic. Vala moved instantly. He pressed his full weight against her legs, anchoring her to the ground. Sophie's trembling fingers sank into his fur, clutching as though he was the only thing holding her here. "Class, line up quickly," Mrs. Anderson called, her voice firm. Children shuffled to the door, casting glances at Sophie, but Valor's broad body shielded her. The teacher crouched, gentle. "It's okay, sweetheart. Just a drill. We'll go together." Sophie squeezed her eyes shut, clinging to the rhythm of Valor's breathing. The rise, the fall, the rise again. Slowly, her own breath followed. Valor nudged her knee once. "I've got you. Let's go." With her teacher on one side and Valor on the other, Sophie stood, legs shaky but moving. Step by step, they crossed the chaos of the hallway until sunlight broke over them outside. The alarm still wailed from the building, but the open air felt safer. Sophie buried her face in Valor's neck, whispering only for him. "Thank you." Back inside, she opened her notebook. Her pencil moved carefully, sketching the moment she couldn't forget. A girl nearly swallowed by fear, and a dog holding her steady. Behind Valor, she drew a faint outline, a shadow of her father's hand resting on the dog's back. Because to Sophie, that was the truth. Valor wasn't just her dog. He was her father's gift, a bridge between what was lost and what still remained. Weeks later, Grace pushed a grocery cart down fluorescent aisles, Sophie holding Valor's leash beside her. For Sophie, even this simple errand had once been impossible. Now, step by step, she was learning to stand taller. They were nearly finished when a sharp voice cut through the calm. "Excuse me, why is there a dog here?" A man in a baseball cap strode toward them, irritation etched in his face. "This is a store. You can't just bring an animal where people buy food. It's unsanitary. It's just a dog." Grace froze, ready to shield Sophie, but she didn't move quickly enough. Sophie stepped forward first. Her voice shook at first, but it carried, "He's not just a dog." The man blinked, surprised. Shoppers paused, watching. Sophie gripped Valor's leash tighter, her small shoulders straightening. "He saves me, every single day." Her voice grew steadier with each word. "When I get scared, when the world feels too loud, he helps me breathe. He's the reason I can even come here with my mom. Without him, I'd still be lost." The man's face softened. Around them, murmurs rose. "That's a service dog," someone whispered. "My nephew has one. Changed his whole life." Even the cashier paused, eyes glistening. Grace stood frozen, tears pricking her eyes. Her daughter, once silent, once curled into herself, was now standing in the middle of a store, speaking her truth for all to hear. Valor pressed against Sophie's leg, grounding her words with his presence. The man looked down, shame flickering across his face. "I didn't know," he muttered. "I'm sorry." Tugging his cap lower, he turned and walked away. Silence lingered, then broke into nods and quiet smiles from strangers. Grace knelt, pulling Sophie into her arms. "You were so brave," she whispered through tears. Sophie clung to her, whispering back, "I wasn't brave by myself. He made me brave." Grace touched her daughter's chest gently. "Maybe, but the voice that spoke, that was yours." And in that aisle of canned soup and cereal, Sophie had stepped out of the shadows. She had claimed her story, and in doing so, softened the hearts of strangers. A few nights later, rain tapped against the windows as Sophie sat cross-legged on the floor painting. The room smelled of acrylic and wet earth. Valor lay nearby, watching each stroke with patient eyes. Grace lingered at the doorway, breath catching. For months, Sophie's drawings had been dark, heavy, but this canvas bloomed with light. "What are you working on?" Grace asked softly. "A surprise," Sophie murmured, shielding the canvas until she was finished. At last she leaned back with paint-smeared fingers. "Okay, now you can look." Grace stepped closer, and her breath caught. 3 figures filled the canvas. Sophie herself, small, but radiant in a swirl of blues and purples. Beside her stood Valor, proud and strong, and above them, surrounded in soft gold and white, was Daniel, watching over them, his hand lifted in blessing. The background wasn't dark but bright. A meadow speckled with wildflowers, a sky washed in light. Sophie's voice trembled but steady. "This is us. We're still a family. Daddy's gone, but he's not really gone. And Valor is here. And you. It's not broken anymore. It's different. But it's still us." Grace pressed a hand to her mouth, tears spilling freely. "Oh, Sophie, it's beautiful. You're beautiful." Valor nudged Sophie's arm, leaving a streak of paint on her sleeve. She giggled, the sound like a bell through the room, and Grace laughed too, shaky but real. They sat together, staring at the canvas, a portrait not of loss, but of legacy, of love woven into color. Grace realized Sophie wasn't just painting what she saw. She was painting what she believed. "This," Grace whispered, her hand over Sophie's, "is the bravest thing I've ever seen." That night, the canvas stood proudly on the mantel, still gleaming in places where the paint was wet. Before bed, Sophie whispered, "Can we keep it there forever? So Daddy can see us?" Grace kissed her forehead. "Forever." As she closed the door, she paused, her eyes drawn to the canvas once more. For years, memories had been reminders of what was gone. But this painting was different. It wasn't about loss. It was about what still remained. They were still a family. And maybe, just maybe, the future wasn't painted in shadows after all. The seasons shifted quietly. Spring mornings gave way to the warmth of early summer. Tulips in the front yard withered, roses bloomed, and bees hummed lazily through the air. For Sophie, time no longer dragged like a weight. She spoke more now, sometimes cautiously, sometimes with sudden bursts of eagerness. At school, her teachers marveled. She raised her hand, shared ideas, even laughed on the playground. Therapy, once a place of silence, became a space she entered with quiet anticipation. She carried drawings, told stories, sometimes about her father, sometimes about nightmares, but always Valor was part of her words. "He makes the dark feel smaller," she explained one day, stroking the dog's fur. At home, life softened into rhythm. Grace often found Sophie on the porch steps, whispering secrets into Valor's ear, while the shepherd leaned against her side. His muzzle now carried strands of silver. Each time sunlight caught them, Grace's heart clenched. Gratitude mingled with dread. Time was leaving its mark. One warm evening, Sophie tugged her mother into the backyard. Under the oak tree, she spread a blanket and art supplies. Valor lay close, relaxed, but watchful. Sophie held up a drawing. Bright fields, a house with open windows, herself running with Valor. In the corner, faint in the sky, her father smiled. "This is summer," she explained. Grace smoothed the paper, kissed her forehead. "It's beautiful." Days stretched long, filled with Sophie's laughter. She chased Valor with a stick, or curled beside him to read aloud. He listened as if every word mattered. Yet Grace noticed the changes. Valor's slower gait, his deeper rests. Sophie never did. To her, he was simply love in its purest form. One twilight, Sophie whispered with certainty, "When Valor gets really old, Daddy will take care of him in the sky. Then they'll both watch me." Grace blinked back tears, squeezing her daughter's hand. "I think you're right. Daddy will be waiting." Fireflies flickered in the yard. Grace watched her daughter hug the aging shepherd, and her chest filled with ache and awe. The seasons had shifted, but love remained, steady as the stars. The first day of middle school carried its own weight. The hallways buzzed with squeaking sneakers and slamming lockers. For Sophie, it was not just noise. It was a battlefield of stares and whispers. Valor walked beside her, calm and steady, brushing her leg with every step. Heads turned. "Why she got a dog?" someone whispered. Sophie's cheeks burned, but Valor's gaze anchored her. She breathed out and kept walking. At lunch, the cafeteria brimmed with laughter and chatter. Sophie stood by the doorway, tray trembling in her hands. She felt the knot of insecurity twist in her stomach. Then Valor nudged her hand with his nose, grounding her. She spotted a corner table and sat. The girls nearby glanced at Valor and whispered, "That's so cool," before returning to their phones. Sophie ate quietly, but she wasn't alone. Valor's warmth pressed against her legs. His steady breathing reminded her she could belong anywhere with him beside her. Not everyone was kind. One Friday after math, a boy muttered, "Why does she need that dog? She looks fine to me." Laughter followed. Sophie froze, shame burning in her chest. Before she could retreat, Valor stepped forward, planting himself firmly in front of her. His calm frame was unmovable, daring anyone to dismiss his place. And Sophie, shaking, but steadied by him, found her voice. "He's not just a dog," she said. Her voice trembled, but it carried, "He helps me every single day. You don't have to understand. But he's the reason I'm standing here at all." The hallway stilled. The boy looked away. Sophie's heart pounded, but something inside her shifted. For the first time, she had defended herself, not just with Valor's presence, but with her own words. That night, she told Grace. At first, anger flashed in her mother's eyes. But then she pulled Sophie close, whispering fiercely, "I'm proud of you. So proud." Middle school was not easy. Whispers lingered. Doubts returned. But Sophie was braver now, because she knew how it felt to face storms and still breathe through them. The art room became her sanctuary. She entered competitions, timid at first, clutching canvases as though afraid to be laughed at. But each time she painted her truth, people didn't laugh. They listened. One spring evening, the school gym transformed into a gallery. Under soft lights, Sophie's painting hung in the center, herself and Valor, their shadows stretching toward a man in the sky. Her father's eyes, painted gentle and proud, watched over them. Grace's throat caught when she saw it. And when Sophie's name was called for an award, her daughter's hands trembled, but her smile broke open like sunlight. From the back of the room, Valor barked once, low, proud, as if he knew this was his victory too. The audience laughed softly, touched. Sophie giggled through her nerves, clutching her ribbon like a treasure. Driving home, Sophie leaned against the window, the ribbon in her lap, Vala's head heavy against her knee. Grace glanced back, her chest aching with gratitude. "Your dad would have loved that painting," she whispered. Sophie turned, eyes glowing. "I didn't just paint it for him," she said. "I painted it for us." That night, after Sophie had gone to bed, Grace sat on the porch with Vala. The air smelled faintly of rain. Vala pressed against her side, his muzzle grayer now, his eyes tired but steady. She stroked his fur, her voice breaking. "You've done so much." You gave her back her voice. "You gave me back my daughter." Vala lifted his head, catching the porch light in his amber eyes. They were old eyes, but unwavering. Grace exhaled, tears streaking her cheeks. She had once believed they were broken beyond repair. Yet somehow, through Sophie's resilience, Vala's patience, and love that refused to surrender, they had stitched something stronger than before. In the weeks that followed, Sophie's courage bloomed. She read aloud in class. She laughed with friends. She painted not from grief, but from hope. There were still storms, but she no longer faced them alone. One morning, Grace lingered at the school entrance. She watched Sophie walk down the hall, laughing with a friend, her shoulders no longer hunched. Vala sat calmly by the door, tail sweeping once before resting again. Grace knelt beside him, pressing her forehead to his. "We did it," she whispered, though she knew he had carried more than his share of the weight. "She's becoming who she was always meant to be." Vala exhaled slowly, a sound like agreement, and for the first time in years, Grace dared to dream of a future not defined by loss, but by what they had built together: a daughter's courage, a mother's hope, and a shepherd's loyalty. A family stitched together by grief, but carried forward by love. The gymnasium smelled faintly of wax and flowers. Balloons swayed in the rafters. Banners of blue and gold fluttered against the hum of the crowd. Grace sat near the front, her hands clasped tight. She had dreamed of this moment for years, the day her daughter would cross a stage once thought impossible. Sophie sat in her chair among the graduates, her gown pressed, her cap slightly askew. At her feet lay Vala. His fur had turned silver with age, but his eyes remained sharp and steady. When Sophie's name was called, the applause rose like a wave. And then, one single bark from Vala, deep and sure, echoing through the gym like a blessing. Sophie wheeled forward, not rushing, not hiding. She moved with quiet dignity, her gown pooling, her smile steady. The principal handed her the diploma, but instead of turning back, Sophie rolled to the podium. A hush rippled through the room. "Good evening," she began. Her voice trembled, then steadied. "Most of you know me, and most of you know Valor. Some people see a service dog. I see my best friend." A murmur of warmth spread. Sophie glanced down at Valor, then lifted her eyes again. "When I was younger, I thought healing meant fixing. I thought it meant going back to before life changed. But I've learned something different." She paused. "Healing doesn't mean going back. It means moving forward, with love." The words struck like a soft bell. Grace pressed a hand to her mouth, tears spilling freely. Around the room, parents, teachers, and students sat spellbound. Sophie's hand brushed Valor's graying head. "I wouldn't be here without him. On days when I couldn't breathe, he was steady. And my mom, she never gave up on me, even when I wanted to give up on myself." Her voice grew firm. So today, I'm not just graduating. I'm celebrating. I'm celebrating the love that carried me, the loyalty that steadied me, and the courage that grew because of both. For a long heartbeat, silence lingered. Then applause thundered, rolling up to the rafters. People stood, cheering, wiping their eyes. Valor barked again, once, proud. Sophie smiled wider, her shoulders lifting as though a weight had fallen away. When she returned to her seat, classmates reached to squeeze her hand. Valor stretched at her feet, eyes half closed, as though satisfied. His girl had taken yet another step into her own light. Grace sat frozen, chest aching with joy. She thought of the little girl who once whispered only into her dog's fur. That girl was gone, not erased, but transformed. In her place sat this young woman, luminous, whole, and beside her always was the dog who had carried her there. But time is relentless. Valor's muzzle grew whiter, his steps slower, his breaths heavier, until one winter morning, with Sophie's hand resting on his fur, he simply closed his eyes and drifted into a sleep from which he did not wake. The silence in the house was crushing. Sophie sat on the floor for hours, her tears soaking his coat. Grace and Daniel flanked her, their grief heavy but softened by pride. Valor's absence was not emptiness, it was legacy. He had carried Sophie through shadows into light, teaching her that love could be both shield and bridge. Life carried forward. Sophie studied psychology, driven to help children find their voices the way she had found hers. She volunteered at therapy centers, guiding trembling hands to stroke therapy dogs, coaxing words from silence. Sometimes she swore she felt Valor just behind her shoulder, steady, watchful, proud. She began speaking at conferences, sharing her story, not as a tragedy, but as a testament. Healing doesn't always come from medicine or miracles, she told crowded rooms. Sometimes it comes from presence, from loyalty, from love that stays even when the world breaks. For me, healing had a name. His name was Valor. Audiences wept, not from pity, but from recognition, because everyone has known pain. Everyone longs for the kind of loyalty Valor gave. And Sophie always ended with the same words, her smile gentle, her voice carrying both love and challenge. Maybe you are someone's Valor. Maybe someone was once yours. The applause in those rooms always echoed, like it once had in the gymnasium. But Sophie knew the truest applause was not in sound. It lived in every heart changed by her story, by Valor's story, because his loyalty had not ended with his life. It had become her voice, her courage, her gift to the world. And through her, Valor lived on. Sometimes the most powerful medicine in life doesn't come from a doctor's hand, but from the quiet loyalty of a four-legged friend who chooses to walk beside us. Stories like Sophie and Valor's remind us that German shepherds, and dogs everywhere, are more than pets. They are guardians, teachers, and companions who steady us when the world feels uncertain. Their love is wordless, yet it speaks louder than anything we could ever say. If you've ever wondered how to deepen that bond with your own dog, there are some wonderful resources out there that offer gentle guidance and inspiration. One I've come across has been a real treasure, and it might be something you'd enjoy exploring too, only if it feels right for you. At the end of the day, every wagging tail and every loyal gaze is a reminder that we are never truly alone. Maybe you've already had a Valor in your life, or maybe you're raising one right now. Either way, cherish those moments. They are the kind that stay with us forever.